When Delta awoke, the glaring sunlight hurted her eyes, but Zele and the idiot Jin were nowhere in sight. She blames the small figure perching on top of the stone wall for her weird dream. The small figure introduces itself as the legendary Grand Sage. Delta threatens her. It doesn't work at first, but when the Grand Sage was reading out instructions, Delta slashed the steel on which the Grand Sage was standing on in half. She learns that Zele and the Jin are fine, and that there are other Grand Sages. Delta then asks how to get to the floating isles in Dark Castle, and the Grand Sage gives her the most difficult puzzle. A reference from the Feynman lectures on physics. Surprisingly, the puzzle seemed to have come from the few pages that Delta read, but the Grand Sage was more taken aback by the fact that Delta knew the content of the scriptures left by the Grand Sage. Suddenly, another small figure, Grand Sage X. They get Delta to walk into a trap, but she doesn't care. After stamping her foot a few times, Delta concludes that the real ruins are underground. Meanwhile, somewhere in the ruins in a badly lit chamber, Alice, Zele, Waterjin, and Grand Sage Y are playing board RPG for adventurers. All of a sudden, there was a loud thump as something had crashed into the iron door of the chamber. Then came a deluge of thumps which finally ceased when the door broke away from the frame and smashed into the wall. Delta had arrived along with the two Grand Sages who were bound by her tail. She raised her greatsword, pointed it at Alice, and explained that the small figures are just support ELFs, not the real Grand Sage. Delta speculates that Alice is the real Grand Sage, but Alice refuses to answer. Suddenly, Alice's body emitted a glaring white light, teleporting everyone back to the surface of the ruins. After battling and collecting data on Delta, Alice reveals the truth. The real Grand Sage had been gone for ages, and they were made to continue the research and protect the ruins. With the result of Alice's analysis, she reveals that Delta does not belong to this world, just like the Dark Lord. Alice and the three ELFs then apologizes to Delta for mistaking her as the Dark Lord. When the Dark Lord descended, it brought infinite monsters and destruction, as well as countless magical devices and books from another world. In the hopes of finding out ways to defeat the Dark Lord, the Grand Sage studied those devices and books, compiled the useful information, and, at the end of her life, utilized all of her knowledge to build an unparalleled magic barrier to keep humanity safe. Alice is the core of the barrier, and this place is a training ground for adventurers who would later be sent to the floating isles. The barrier is a one-way passage, and only after the energy of the Dark Lord had dissipated would the barrier collapse. But then, if Bronya had already defeated the Dark Lord, why is the barrier still on? Alice doesn't know, but she considers their team strong enough to continue to the floating isles. She then points out a characteristic of each member, and says that the Water Djinn resembles the Grand Sage, shocking everyone. The Grand Sage had silver hair, blue eyes, was the same height as Alice, and always wore a trencher cap and a pair of round spectacles, yet her favorite clothes were a blue and white dress that made her look like Alice in Wonderland. That said, the reason Alice is named Alice is because it's a name she chose for herself. Alice was once named Omega, a code name given by the Grand Sage, but she didn't like it and wanted a real name. Curious, she brings up Delta's name. Delta explains that names are for remembering people or something, and she has nothing worth remembering, so a code name for others to refer to is enough. Before the team moves on, Zele invites Alice to go with them. However, as the barrier still needs to be maintained, Alice cannot leave, so Zele changes the invite to after the Dark Lord is defeated, and Alice says she will wait for her. About 30 minutes after reaching the floating isles, the team is being treated to a welcome party. Zele is surprised and thought the floating isles would be a chaotic place with swarms of monsters, and Rita tells her that it used to be like that. As the party is taking forever to end, Delta tries to leave, and is stopped by Zele, who wants to leave with her. But before they do, Zele wants to question the adventurers here. As soon as she mentioned Bronya, everyone quieted down. The party ended, the adventurers dispersed, and Rita started cleaning up. Fu Hua, the founder of the base, enters the scene and leads them to an open area outside the base. She says that they can see Bronya when they reach the highest point in the neighborhood, but she wants to deal with a lurking danger among them first, Miss Water Djinn. Fu Hua reveals that the real Water Djinn, her friend, left this world before her eyes. Water Djinn, Forest Djinn, Grand Sage, and Fu Hua were the first to come to the floating isles. Despite countless attempts, they were unable to defeat the Dark Lord, so they let the Grand Sage leave to research ways to defeat it in a safer area, while the rest of them stayed behind to buy time. The Grand Sage failed, but managed to create a barrier, while at the same time, the Dark Lord launched a final assault, filling the skies full of dark rifts from which deluges of monsters came. As Water Djinn became exhausted, a dark rift suddenly formed near Water Djinn, consuming everything nearby, like a black hole. The floating isle under their feet shattered, and Forest Djinn fell down together with it, while Fu Hua held onto Water Djinn's hand, but Water Djinn pushed her away and was consumed by the rift. Our Water Djinn then reveals that she's actually Water Djinn's little sister. She waited for her sister's and Forest Djinn's return, yet only Forest Djinn came back, but she refused to give her answers and wouldn't give her entry to the ruins. So she wrote the Adventurer's Guide, hoping that any adventurer guided by her would bring back intel about her sister, but not a single one returned. Then she met Delta, joined her team, and destroyed her last glimmer of hope, but why? Sometimes it's easier to be hopeless. A glimmer of hope is even more depressing than sheer desperation. Fu Hua then leads them to the mountaintop, and focused their gaze towards the Dark Castle. The old Dark Lord had already been defeated, and Zele's sister, Bronya, had become the new Dark Lord. Zele froze with shock, and her scythe dropped to the ground. Fu Hua explains that Bronya wasn't talented or had magic powers like other adventurers, but she would come to her for instructions and training every day. Later she formed a commando of adventurers and carried out a raid on the Dark Castle. It was a tough battle, yet despite defeating the Dark Lord, Bronya, who was next to the Dark Lord's corpse, noticed something unusual. The Dark Lord's body suddenly emitted a cold light, and blasted everyone except Bronya out of the Dark Castle. The gate had been closed ever since, but the barrier was still on. Then, the number of monsters started to increase again, so Fu Hua sent several adventurers to inspect the Dark Castle. The gate to the Dark Castle was somehow opened, and there was a new Dark Lord inside that looked just like Bronya. Fu Hua couldn't believe it, and went to the Dark Castle herself to verify the validity of their claims, and was attacked by Bronya using the power of the Dark Lord. Zele frantically clutched Fu Hua for a moment, then stepped back and picked up her weapon, her eyes filled with tears. She just couldn't believe this, but she knew, from the bottom of her heart, that Fu Hua didn't lie to them. Delta then waved her hand and started walking down the mountain. She tells Zele if she wants to find out the truth, she can come with her, but if she had already lost all her courage, then she can stay. Delta is leaving either way. It doesn't matter whether the Dark Lord is Bronya or not, she'll kill it if it gets in the way. Suddenly, they receive news that the base is surrounded by hordes of monsters. After Fu Hua goes back first, Delta asks the team what they want to do. Water Jin doesn't know, but since Zele wants to help the adventurers, Delta leaves with Zele. At the base, Fu Hua eventually notices something unusual about the monsters, as if the Dark Lord was leading them. She suggests that Delta not waste her time here, and defeat the Dark Lord. Delta asks Zele again if she wants to go with her, but she's conflicted about leaving the adventurers here until Water Jin arrives to take her place. Water Jin tells Zele she has to be there for her sister no matter what. And so, Delta and Zele head towards the Dark Lord's castle.
终于要到了，放心吧，希尔 ，Bronya 很快就会回来，勇者一定会打败魔王的。姐姐，再等我一会儿。但是，如果 Bronya 一直没回来，希尔。 不要来找 Bronya。Bronya， 姐姐，怎么会？姐。
On the throne in the castle sat a young girl, tightly holding an egg in her arms with a relieved smile on her face. Zele did not understand what she saw. She slowly raised her hand and tried to touch the girl on the throne.
Bronya， 姐姐，希尔，离那座石像远点。希尔。
Zele could no longer hear Delta, and embraced the girl on the throne desperately, but the girl on the throne did not respond to her words or tears.
姐姐 ，Bronya 姐姐，你快醒醒！戴尔大姐。 你总是有那么多的办法，你一定有办法让Bronya姐姐醒过来的，对不对？你一定有办法。对不起，我不确定。也就是说，戴尔大姐可能会有办法的，对吧？并不是一点办法都没有，对吧？希尔，你冷静一点。
Suddenly, a vague voice came from the shade behind the throne, spread like mist, and then condensed into a dark figure. Before Zele could react, Delta already drew her sword and stood before her.
Bronya, 姐姐，退后，希尔。
Zele's fingertips came in contact with the egg, and the next moment, black mist gushed out of the egg, overwhelming the two girls. As Delta fought, she noticed something strange. Even though Bronya's shade attacked her at full strength, it didn't follow her when she kept her distance, and the moment she stepped towards the statue, the shade would make an attack stance. A teardrop suddenly rolled down the statue's face, and dripped onto the egg it held. The egg let out a short glint in response, and in that moment, though brief, was enough for Delta to see what was hiding inside the egg.
原来就在那里吗？也对，这里已经没有其他东西了。我早该想到的。
Delta explains to Zele that Bronya is not the Dark Lord. When Bronya found she couldn't beat the Dark Lord, she sacrificed herself to protect the world. Though Delta doesn't know how she became a statue, she had successfully sealed the Dark Lord inside the egg. The shade is straining herself, which suggests that Bronya's life force is wearing out, and as they talked, it became too weak to attack anyone. If they break the egg, Bronya will be free, but so will the Dark Lord. As Zele pondered on what to do, Delta didn't say a word, and gazed at Zele in silence, waiting for her to make her own choice. Zele comes to the conclusion that someone has to sacrifice themselves to save the world like Bronya. Still, she wants to save her sister, wants to save the world, but doesn't want to give anyone up.
那就先救出你的姐姐，再来想办法拯救这个世界吧。啊，希尔，你确实和布罗尼亚不一样，但你们都是勇者。而希尔说的，不想牺牲任何人。这虽然是个天真的想法，但它本身并没有错。至于这个世界炮，虽说它变成怎样都和我没什么关系，但事情既然已经变成现在这样了，迪尔塔姐。
Delta reminds Zele that she came here to look for something, and reveals that what she had been looking for had been consumed by the Dark Lord. She then picked up her greatsword, and started walking towards Bronya's statue.
希尔，现在可以回答你之前的问题了。其实，打败魔王的方法有很多种，看我想选择哪种而已。我就应该先关掉通讯器，然后再进来。说吧，什么事？
我已经收到任务报告了。欢迎回来 ，Delta。
我还有事，晚点再聊，拜。
等等 ，Delta。
干嘛？我现在正在泡澡，没心情和你聊工作。
The voice on the call asks for her opinion on the mission, but Delta says she doesn't remember them caring, as they only care about the result, not the process.
人都是会变的。
但你不会。
Delta describes the mission like that of a typical role-playing game. The only thing interesting was the final boss. The voice then mentioned that in Delta's report, the target had been consumed, and assimilated by that Honkai beast, and Delta replied by saying that's the main reason why she chose to abort the mission. When the voice inquired about the other reasons, Delta says it was a slip of the tongue, but she assured them that she didn't do anything to anyone in that bubble universe.
戴尔塔姐，我做完200组俯卧撑了，我可以进来和你一起泡澡吗？就我离开的这点时间，只够你做100，不，80组吧。罗萨莉亚，我就说你骗不过戴尔塔姐的。可是我的腿好酸，手好酸，腰也好酸，哪里都酸。戴尔塔姐，我想泡澡嘛。下去，再加200组。
Having chased off the twins, Delta mentions that since there are no new missions, she's gonna go investigate that, but the voice on the call denies her and says, there's no need for you to meet him at the moment. After the call ends, Delta speaks to her tail as if it were someone else.
没事，别勉强自己。你不用接受我现在的样子。你可以讨厌我，不，你一定会讨厌现在的我。你问我吗？说不上喜欢不喜欢吧。从那天起，我就别无选择，不是吗？泡澡泡太久，果然是会头晕啊。